Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, a visually distinct fighting game, a sequel to an SNES favorite, and a next-generation console fails to start the next generation. Hi, I'm your host, Jared, and today is November 17th, 1993. Leap ahead of the competition, skip a generation to dominate the next. It was the original household name, making a final gambit to become the king of the console once again. Released on November 23rd, 1993, was the Atari Jaguar.
Jaguar by Atari is the only video game system with 64 bits of awesome power. This irresponsible action into the living rooms of our young people.
Get bit by Jaguar.
The Atari Jaguar was the world's first 64-bit home console. It boasted superior processing power well beyond that of the competition. It can do 2D games, 3D games, and eventually CD games. The controller has not 4 buttons, not 8 buttons, but 17 buttons. A long list of publisher support and a visually impressive pack-in title backed by a competitive, affordable price. Ditch away those now archaic consoles and get bit by the Jaguar. Here on Now in the 90s, we do our best to cover something if it released during the week leading up to the episode's date. The Atari Jaguar should be in next week's episode, but that one's already jammed packed with some other guy, so we're choosing to talk about it here. The Atari Jaguar is Atari's newest console. There was a time in history where everyone had an Atari 2600, or VCS if you prefer. Sure, the Atari 5200 and the Atari 7800 never quite took off, but people knew what they were. It wasn't until the Nintendo Entertainment System that the name Atari began to lose its marketing power. Kids were going home to play Nintendo. They weren't playing Atari anymore, but they had a plan. Make a console that is leaps ahead of the competition. As the 16-bit Sega Genesis released and Nintendo was about to release their 16-bit Super Nintendo with the TurboGrafx 16 already out, Atari was preparing a 32-bit machine. It was called the Atari Panther, set to release in 1991. But at literally the same time, Atari was also making a 64-bit machine called the Atari Jaguar, ready to drop well ahead of whatever other console release the other guys could do. As development on both continued, they were making better progress on the Jaguar than the Panther, so they just canceled the Panther altogether and focused on the bigger hardware. Now, in the 90s, people didn't understand hardware specs, but they did understand bits. More bits was better. People knew the NES was 8-bit, the Genesis 16-bit, the Neo Geo was 24-bit, there was rumors of upcoming 32-bit machines, which is why the Jaguar came out guns blazing at 64 bits. People wanted more bits. Atari used this for their advertising to make it as plain as simple. Do the math.
Some of you believe your system is the most advanced in the universe. Let's review the numbers. Sega Genesis is 16 bits. 3DO is 32 bits. The Atari Jaguar is 64 bits. Which is more advanced? Clifford! So with 64 bits, 3D graphics, real-world animation, and lightning speed that you can only get with Jaguar, which is more advanced? Clifford!
Can you repeat the question?
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
The Atari Jaguar was first shown at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show of 1993, though mostly behind closed doors. Journalists walked away calling it earth-shattering. 16 million colors, 3D polygon performance equal to that of the 3DO. Comes with a game and a controller for a paltry price of $200? That's a good deal. This was all backed by a long list of third-party support. Acclaim, Virgin, Ubisoft, Activision. But people quickly noticed that there wasn't a single Japanese developer on board with the console. The problems for the Jaguar started cascading. Frequent restructuring of the hardware and chipset caused some issues with developers making their games. The promised $200 price point suddenly became $250 shortly before launch. Then people found out that the 64-bit machine was actually two 32-bit processors that could work together, which technically adds up to 64-bit, but it was difficult to use and program for. To make up for this, there's also a familiar chip for developers to use that emphasizes classic 2D graphics, because that was simpler to make and that's what was familiar many of the Jaguar games ended up looking like barely improved 16-bit games. It was supposed to have 5 games available at launch, which ended up being 2, the pack-in title Cybermorph and Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy. When journalists finally got to play the machine in early August 1993, they walked away unimpressed, saying that the 2D games didn't look very good and the 3D games could easily just be done on the Super Nintendo. Its launch did not go well. It's estimated at best only 17,000 units were sold at launch, likely less than that. For comparison's sake, the Super Nintendo's initial shipment was 300,000. Their games lineup lacked familiar titles or heavy hitters. Also, people hated the controller. Atari said they anticipated Jaguar sales should reach 500,000 by the end of 1994. They supported this by dropping the Jaguar's price and announcing things like the Jaguar CD add-on and the Jaguar VR headset. By the end of it all, the Jaguar's lifetime sales hit just over 125,000 units. By comparison, the 3DO, which cost $500 more than the Jaguar, hit around 2 million units. In the Jaguar's defense, it did have some good games. Alien vs. Predator is seen as the best game possible for it. Tempest 2000 was a really good update to an arcade classic, and it did have very solid ports of Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. By the end of the console's lifespan, it had a grand total of about 60 games made for it. It wasn't enough. The Atari Jaguar did so poorly and tanked in sales so badly, it put Atari, the granddaddy progenitor of the video games industry, out of business. Their names and IPs has since been divided up to several highest bidders. As for the Jaguar itself, it does live on. The patents for it were released in 1999, where the Jaguar has since enjoyed a lively homebrew community that's still going strong to this day. And you may have seen a Jaguar itself, in all places, at the dentist's office. One of the first cameras designed for looking inside your mouth used the exact same plastic mold as the Atari Jaguar. When something gets immensely popular, someone's bound to make fun of it. Released on November 15th for the Super NES, was Clayfighter. Clayfighter is a one-on-one fighting game. Pick one of 8 characters, all made of clay, many of which themselves are a parody of something else. Punch, kick, jump, and perform special moves unique to each character. Fight a boss at the end and see the character's ending, and of course, it has a 2-player versus mode. Clayfighter was developed by Visual Concepts. They had already begun experimenting with using the photo digitization technology as seen in games like Mortal Kombat and Pit Fighter, if you remember that one. They are working on a platformer titled Claymates, which featured characters all made of clay, which would release in 1994. With the success of Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, they quickly put together a parody fighting game meant to lampoon as many fighting games as they could. Graphically, it did look good. The clay characters did look impressive without the need of any kind of additional FX chip or something similar. A lot of effort went into the clay models and painstakingly taking every single frame of animation for each one. You can admire that. All of the magazine advertisements for Clayfighter took direct shots at every other fighting game out there that it could. They directly copied the template for Mortal Kombat print ads. They had another one clearly showing Chun-Li getting stomped to death, and another even showed them attacking the world heroes. The only thing Clayfighter really had going for it was parody. The game itself isn't particularly noteworthy or very enjoyable. Interplay wasn't trying to sell it by merit alone, instead relying on aggressive marketing strategies to push copies. It does have an annoyingly catchy theme song though. Reviews for the game were generally positive though. Electronic Gaming Monthly awarded it a 7.5 out of 10, stating that it isn't just a mindless fighting game clone with standout graphics and digitized voice samples. Nintendo Power also gave it a 3.75 out of 5, of course, loving the graphics. For whatever reason, Clayfighter doesn't end there. In May 1994, 6 months later, it would get an updated version with Clayfighter Tournament Edition, which in itself was meant to make fun of Street Fighter II and all its updates and revisions. That Tournament Edition, however, would be a Blockbuster exclusive rental game. Then it would get a sequel with C2 Judgment Clay in 1995, and of course, Clayfighter 63 1/3 for the Nintendo 64. That was the last time we saw the series. Although they did announce a full remake in 2015, and then quietly never said anything about that ever again. One of the finest SNES games gets a low-key sequel. Released in November 1993, was Total Carnage. Total Carnage is a top-down shooter. Play as Captain Carnage and Major Mayhem, blasting everything in your way. Move with the D-pad and use the face buttons to shoot in that direction. Find all kinds of high-powered weaponry through tons of power-ups, defeat some bosses, rescue some people, and of course, do it all in 2-player co-op. Total Carnage was developed by Midway and is a port of the arcade game of the same name. The game itself is more or less a spiritual sequel to the hit arcade game Smash TV. It has similar gameplay, the same controls, and was made by the same team. One of the bosses in the game is voiced by Ed Boon of Mortal Kombat. The SNES version is the first home port made available of Total Carnage. While Smash TV was a smash in the arcades and also for the SNES, Total Carnage was not successful in the arcades. And wouldn't you know it, it didn't do too hot on the SNES either. My personal guess is that people just didn't know that it was basically a sequel to the beloved Smash TV. It did review mostly okay. GamePro gave it a 3.75 out of 5. Nintendo Power gave only a 3 out of 5. The struggling game, even at home, caused Midway to rethink some of their plans. The upcoming Sega Genesis and Sega CD ports, which were advertised as coming, got cancelled. Total Carnage has been included in compilation games like Midway Arcade Treasures. The lackluster response did make the original team change directions from not making a third one, which thankfully resulted in them creating a series called NBA Jam. He was 64 bits before it was cool. For every other release this week, here's Editor Dylan.
You ever want to play a 2D fighter with opponents like Shampoo, Pantyhose, or a literal panda? Well, you're weird. Also, Ranma 1/2 Hard Battle released on the SNES this week. It's based on the manga of the same name and is about a boy who falls into a cursed lake and turns into a woman whenever he touches cold water. I only saw the first episode of the anime adaptation and I can't get past the dumb premise. I'm sorry. There's no such thing as gender-bending curses and I'll prove it. I'm gonna travel to the exact lake this was based on and jump in. Watch this NHL Stanley Cup ad until I get back.
It may be too much to handle. It's Mode 7 rig rotation and bone-crushing checks. It's NHL Stanley Cup hockey, part of the Super NES Sports Network, and it's in a league of its own.
I was wrong. Pro Sport Hockey for the NES is a simplified version of Pro Sport Hockey for the SNES, which comes out next year. So let's move on to Jimmy Connors Tennis, also on the NES. It's like a simplified version of International Tennis Tour on the SNES, which is a tennis game. Did anyone notice I'm a girl now? Dig and Spike is not a game that has you spelunking in an ancient buried tomb littered with booby traps. It's actually a, hey, eyes up here, okay pal? It's actually a volleyball game that doesn't star scantily clad fighting game characters, so there's really nothing worth talking about. What? Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I can't appreciate highly exaggerated jiggle physics, all while spiking the ball directly into the opponent's face. Oh! Oh my god! She might be dead. I know I can be a little harsh on sports games. Honestly, they get a bad rap since most parents in the 90s would see us playing them and say, why don't you go outside and play actual sports instead? It'll be good exercise. Or some similar parental spiel. But Outback Joey with Heartbeat Personal Trainer is just the thing you need to put those concerns to rest. Because this game is only playable with rigorous physical activity. I think. I've never actually played it because I don't have a Sega Genesis, and we don't typically cover unlicensed games. And it's over $5,000, but the only way to play is by exercising. My body is ready. I attached the heart rate sensor, and now let's watch another NHL Stanley Cup ad while I get real hot and sweaty.
For this kid, it's more than a game. It's a dream. And it's about to be realized in the best game of hockey he's ever played. NHL Stanley Cup, only on Super Nintendo. Only Mode 7 graphics puts you right on the ice, and in the middle of the most realistic action video game hockey. NHL Stanley Cup, only on Super NES. It's the ultimate power play. System and game sold separately. Stanley Cup not included.
Okay, turns out getting really hot and sweaty counts as being doused in warm water, so now I'm a man. Which is convenient because I was about to have a pack attack. on the Genesis. I know I used that joke already, but I don't care. I need a shower. 12 games came out on these consoles this week in 1993. Hey Jared, if you want, I could touch on Cybermorph and Trevor McFur more next week since they only got a brief mention today.
Yeah, sure.
Alright, cool. I'll just try to think of some clever comebacks in case I get asked where I learned to fly.
You learn to...
Shut up! Save it for next week.
Hey, jokes aside, do you want to come over and play Atari Jaguar with me?
If by play you mean try to get it to work for a couple hours, yeah, sure, let's crack it open, see if we can fix it.
Alright, cool, that'll be tight.
Alright, see you in a bit.
Thank you, Dylan. Here in the Collector's Corner, the Atari Jaguar had an initial release of $249.99, which included Cybermorph. Now, the console with one controller and all the hookups goes for $380. If you got the original box for it, then it's $560. Cybermorph, meanwhile, is only $13 for the cartridge and $40 for a complete one. Clayfighter has crumbled. It's easy to find the game for about $15 and only $45 for a complete in-box copy. Total Carnage is close to the same. It's only $17 for the cartridge and only $50 for it complete. And that's it for today. Next week, Sonic the Hedgehog. That's it. It's all Sonic. I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. I want to thank some patrons like Crooning Wolf, Steve Gardner, and Brian Foley. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, especially if you played in these games that we mentioned this week or you had an Atari Jaguar at launch, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much for watching this show every single Friday. I have like no real personal experience with the Jaguar, but I had to get one like a decade ago. And kind of like the CDI, there's a big part of me that wants to hook this up and get it working and just mess around with it because I think that would be really fun. That'd be a fun stream, especially if Dylan's over. Do you guys want to watch that? Let me know in the comments.